Montana Territory, 1873. The wind came down from the Bitterroot Mountains like a living thing, howling across the valley and rattling the loose shutters of Colt's cabin. Snow swallowed the earth in thick, restless waves, erasing fence lines and cattle tracks alike. The world beyond his porch had vanished into white. Colt stood alone in the storm, shoulders squared against it, hammering a loose board back into place along the corral. Each strike of the hammer felt steady, controlled, unlike the memories that sometimes crept in when the nights were too quiet. He preferred storms; they drowned out ghosts. At 32, Colt had built a life out of distance. Distance from town gossip, distance from range wars, distance from the grave where his younger brother lay after a foolish cattle dispute turned deadly. Since that winter, he had stopped believing in warm kitchens or shared laughter. A man like him, he figured, did better alone. The hammer paused midair. Through the wind, he heard something unnatural, not the groan of timber or the cry of drifting snow. A knock. He froze. Another knock came, weaker this time, nearly swallowed by the blizzard. Colt crossed the yard in long strides and pushed open the cabin door. A young woman stood there barely. Her dark hair was stiff with frost clinging to her cheeks. Snow layered her thin shawl. One hand braced the doorframe, the other wrapped protectively around her swollen belly. Her lips were pale. Her eyes, fierce despite exhaustion, met his only for a second before her knees buckled. Colt caught her before she struck the floor. She was lighter than she should have been. He shut the door against the storm and carried her to the bed without thinking twice. Snow melted into the worn wood as he laid her down. Her breathing was shallow but steady. She was young, no more than 20. Native by her features and beadwork, though the dress she wore had once belonged to settlers. It was torn near the hem, stained with mud not made by snow. He noticed bruising on her wrist as he removed her frozen shawl. Not accidental. Colt stirred the fire higher, wrapped her in his late mother's quilt, and poured water into a tin cup. When her eyes fluttered open, they were alert, immediately wary. "You're safe," he said quietly. Her gaze darted toward the door at the faint whistle of wind. "No one's safe," she murmured. Her voice carried strength beneath weakness. "What's your name?" Colt asked. She answered after a pause. He nodded once. Colt. Silence settled between them, thick but not empty. "You got family nearby?" he asked. She hesitated too long. No. He didn't press further, not yet, but he saw it in her posture, the tension of someone who had been running long before the storm began. As dusk deepened, the wind worsened. Colt stepped outside briefly to secure the horses. Snow slashed against his face, but through the blur of white he caught sight of something that stilled his breath. Drags. Horse drags. Not his. 3 sets. Fresh. They cut along the ridge east of his property before vanishing into the blowing snow. He felt the old instinct settle into his bones, the one he'd learned during the range wars, the sense of being watched. When he stepped back inside, was sitting upright despite her exhaustion. Her hand gripped the quilt tightly. "You heard them too," she said. "Heard what?" "Riders." Colt studied her. "Who's chasing you?" Her jaw tightened. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she whispered, "Men who believe everything can be owned." The fire cracked sharply. He leaned his rifle against the table within reach. "You planning to bring trouble to my door?" he asked, not accusing, just honest. Her eyes met his fully now. There was pride there and fear. "I didn't plan to survive this long," she said. Something about that answer struck him deeper than he expected. Later that night drifted into uneasy sleep. Colt remained in the chair by the window, rifle resting across his knees. Snow still whipped across the glass, but beneath it he thought he heard something distant and rhythmic. Hoofbeats. He rose slowly and stepped onto the porch. The storm had thinned just enough to reveal shadows moving along the ridge. 3 riders. Watching. Not approaching yet. Waiting. Colt's jaw hardened. Inside the cabin, cried out softly in her sleep. "They'll take my baby," she whispered. The words cut through him sharper than the cold ever could. Colt stood in the doorway, wind tearing at his coat, eyes locked on the dark figures in the distance. He had spent years avoiding other people's battles. But as the riders lingered beyond the snow and the frightened young woman slept under his roof, he understood something clear and certain. The storm outside was only the beginning. And whoever those men were, they weren't leaving without a fight. Morning came slow and colorless. The storm had passed, but the valley lay buried beneath a silence so deep it felt fragile. Snow draped the fences and rooflines in heavy folds, and smoke from Colt's chimney rose straight into a pale sky. Inside, the cabin was already awake. Colt noticed it first by the absence of sound, no restless shifting, no uneasy breaths. He found her standing near the window, one hand braced against the frame, the other resting protectively over her belly. She was pale but steady. "You shouldn't be on your feet," he said. "I've stood through worse," she replied. There was no pride in her tone, only truth. Colt stepped beside her and looked out toward the ridge. The riders were gone, but the tracks remained, 3 horses, deep impressions in the snow. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "Who?" he pressed again. This time she did not avoid his gaze. "Harlan Pike." The name landed heavy. Colt knew it, a trader, owned freight lines between settlements, a man who wore civility like a polished badge but carried violence beneath it. There had been whispers in town, land disputes, threats disguised as contracts. "What's he want with you?" Colt asked. Drew in a slow breath, as if choosing whether to trust him was more dangerous than the storm had been. "He wants control," she said, "of my people, of the trade routes that run through our land." She explained in measured fragments. Pike had come to her tribe months ago, offering supplies and protection in exchange for access through their territory. When the elders hesitated, he proposed something else, marriage, to her. Colt's jaw tightened. "I refused." "And that bruising?" Colt asked quietly. Her fingers instinctively brushed her wrist. "He doesn't like refusal." The fire cracked between them. "My child," she continued, "is not his, but he claims it will be. If he marries me, he gains influence. If I refuse, he takes me anyway." Colt felt the old, dangerous anger stir in his chest. "Why not stay with your tribe?" he asked. "I left so they wouldn't bleed for me," she said simply. "If he chases only one woman, perhaps he spares many." The weight of that choice settled in the room. Later that afternoon, Colt rode into town under the pretense of buying feed. He kept his expression neutral as he tied his horse outside the general store. Inside, conversation dropped when he entered. Harlan Pike stood near the counter. Tall, well-dressed, gloves too fine for frontier work, his smile never reached his eyes. Pike's voice carried easily. "Word is a young native woman has been wandering these parts, carrying something valuable." Colt said nothing. Pike's gaze slid toward him briefly, assessing. "There's a reward," Pike continued smoothly, "for anyone with information." The implication hung thick in the air. Colt left without responding, but the message was clear. This wasn't just pursuit. It was a hunt. When he returned to the ranch near dusk, he found outside, struggling to haul water from the well despite the snow. "You trying to prove something?" he asked sharply. "I won't be helpless in your house," she shot back. He crossed the yard and took the bucket from her before she could protest further. Inside, warmth returned slowly. They sat across from each other at the small table, the oil lamp flickered between them. "You staying here makes you a target," Colt said at last. "I was already one." "That's not what I mean." She held his gaze steadily. "My baby needs a father." The words were not whispered this time, they were deliberate. Colt's breath stalled. "You're not asking for protection," he said slowly. "I am asking for a name," she replied. "A marriage binds law, it complicates ownership, it forces witnesses." Colt leaned back, stunned by the clarity of her strategy. "You barely know me. I know you did not turn me away." The room felt smaller. "I don't marry out of pity," he said. "I don't ask out of weakness," she answered. Silence thickened. Before he could respond, a sharp crack split the air. The cabin window shattered inward. Glass sprayed across the floor as a bullet embedded in the far wall. Colt lunged for his rifle. Outside, horses circled. A familiar voice called from the darkness. "Evening, I believe you're harboring something that belongs to me." Harlan Pike stood slowly, fear flickering across her face, but not surrender. Colt moved toward the door, rifle in hand. "You stay behind me," he ordered. "No," she said firmly, "if this is my fight, I stand in it." Another shot struck the porch railing. Snow began to fall again, soft but relentless, as if the land itself held its breath. Colt stepped out into the cold, boots crunching against ice. 3 riders waited beyond the yard. Pike removed his gloves with deliberate calm. "Send her out," he called, "and I'll ride away peaceful." Colt lifted the rifle slightly. "She's not yours to claim." The wind shifted. Inside the cabin, pressed her hand to her belly and closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, resolve had replaced fear. This would not end with hiding. And the snow, once a shield, was about to become a battlefield. The snow fell softer now, but the cold had sharpened. Colt stood at the edge of his porch, rifle steady in his hands, boots planted firm in the drifts. Across the yard, 3 riders waited in a loose half-circle. Their horses snorted clouds into the twilight. Harlan Pike sat at the center. He looked almost amused. "You've always been stubborn," Pike called out smoothly. "But this isn't your concern. Send her out and I'll spare your property." Colt did lower the rifle. "She ain't property," he replied. Pike smiled thinly. "Everything out here is property to someone." Before Colt could answer, the cabin door creaked open behind him. He turned sharply, stepped out into the falling snow, bareheaded, shoulders straight, one hand resting over the curve of her belly. And Colt began. She moved to stand beside him. The wind tugged at her dark hair, but her voice carried steady across the yard. "My name," she said clearly, "is—" Colt froze. The riders shifted in their saddles. Pike's smile faltered. "You're not married." She lifted her chin. "Frontier law binds by witness and declaration." Her gaze never left Pike's. "And I declare before heaven and earth I belong to this house." The silence that followed was immense. Colt felt the weight of her words settle into him, not as a trap, not as desperation, but as choice. She had chosen him. Pike laughed once, sharp and ugly. "A name won't save you, girl." From the ridge behind the cabin came the sudden rhythm of hooves. All heads turned. 2 riders crested the hill, silhouettes against the pale sky. They bore the markings of Stribe, silent, watchful. They had not come charging. They had come witnessing. People had not abandoned her. They had waited to see what kind of man Colt would be. Pike's confidence wavered, but pride drove him forward. He reached for his pistol. The movement was small, but Colt had been waiting. His rifle cracked through the valley. The shot struck Pike's hand, sending the pistol spinning into the snow. Pike cried out, clutching his wrist as blood stained his glove. The other 2 riders reached for their guns, but the tribal riders descended swiftly, cutting off their angle. Horses collided in a burst of chaos. Colt moved fast, closing the distance before Pike could recover. He kicked the fallen pistol aside and drove Pike backward into the drift. "This ends," Colt growled, pressing the rifle barrel against Pike's chest. Pike's breath came ragged now, arrogance cracking beneath fear. "You shoot me," Pike spat, "and you make yourself an outlaw." Colt's jaw tightened. Behind him's voice rose again, strong, unwavering. "No more blood for me." He glanced back. She wasn't pleading. She was commanding peace. The tribal riders had disarmed the others without killing them. The message was clear: strength did not require slaughter. Colt stepped back from Pike slowly. "You ride out," he said coldly. "You don't return, and you tell anyone who asks that stands under my protection in her tribe." Pike staggered to his feet, cradling his wounded hand. Humiliation burned brighter than pain in his eyes. "This isn't over," he hissed. But he mounted and rode. And this time he did not look back. The valley exhaled. Snow continued to fall, gentler now. Colt turned toward. For a long moment neither spoke. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied, "I did." Her hand trembled slightly now that the danger had passed. He stepped closer, instinctively reaching for her, and she let him. "I meant what I said," she added, "but I will not bind you with fear." Colt looked at the tracks disappearing into white. "I've been running from belonging for years," he admitted, "thought I didn't deserve it." His gaze met hers. "But you didn't ask me to rescue you," he continued. "You asked me to stand beside you." Nodded once. "That is different." He removed his glove and extended his hand to her, not as a shield but as a promise. "Then let's make it true," he said. Spring arrived slowly after that night. Snow melted into rushing creeks. Grass pushed stubbornly through thawed earth. Word spread quietly that Harlan Pike had withdrawn his claims westward, his influence weakened by public failure. On a mild morning beneath open sky, Colt and stood before a small gathering, her 2 tribal witnesses, and an aging circuit preacher from town who valued justice more than prejudice. There was no grand spectacle. Just vows spoken plain. "I choose her," Colt said steadily. "Not obligation." Joy's eyes shone as she answered, "I stand with him." Rings carved from silver and cedar wood were exchanged. And the valley bore witness. Months later, thunder rolled once more across the mountains, but this storm came with warmth. Inside the cabin, Colt knelt beside the bed, gripping his hand as labor her. Fear flickered in him, but he did not retreat. Stay, she whispered through pain. I'm here, he promised. Hours passed like lifetimes. Then, a cry split the air. Strong, fierce, alive. Colt held his son for the first time, hands shaking despite all the battles he'd faced. The child's tiny fingers curled around his own. In that moment, something inside Colt, something long frozen, thawed completely. Outside, rain washed the last traces of winter from the earth. Inside, rested, watching him with quiet triumph. You see, she murmured softly. Colt looked from her to the child and back again. She had come to his door seeking shelter. But she had given him something far greater. A name, a future, a reason to stand and not run. As the storm faded into distant rumble, Colt pressed his forehead gently to his son and whispered, You're safe here. And for the first time in many years. So was he.